You will be shocked when you learn what punishments were used in ancient Egypt. Ancient Egypt appears in our imagination as a world of majestic pyramids, golden sarcophagi, and wise pharaohs. But this civilization, obsessed with the idea of eternal life and divine order, developed a complex system of punishments. Its goal was not simply retribution, but the restoration of the disturbed universal harmony. In this system, the most terrible punishment did not leave scars on the body, but erased the very essence of a person from history. Watch this video to the end, and you will learn what fate was more terrible for the ancient Egyptians than any physical punishment, and why the destruction of one's name was considered a final sentence. I will reveal to you the most closely guarded secret of the Egyptian worldview, which explains the logic of their justice system. To understand the system of punishment in ancient Egypt, one must first understand the concept of Maat. It was not just the name of a goddess, but a fundamental principle of universal truth, harmony, and order. Maat was the cosmic law established by the gods when they created the world. The sun rose and set according to Maat, the Nile flooded according to its laws, and society had to live in obedience to it. Any crime from petty theft to treason was seen not just as an offense against another person, but as an attack on this divine order. Therefore, the main goal of Egyptian justice was not so much to punish the guilty as to restore the disturbed harmony. Punishment became a ritual act that restored peace to a state of equilibrium. It was this idea that underlay all judicial decisions, from fines to complete social exclusion. The Egyptians believed that the pharaoh was the guarantor of Maat on earth. His main task was to maintain order and justice in his state. Through his laws and courts, he transmitted the divine will into everyday life. Judges in Egypt were considered priests of Maat and wore her image as a sign of their authority. Their decisions had to be impartial and wise because more than the fate of one person was at stake. The stability of the entire universe was at stake. This worldview shaped a special attitude toward the law. It was not just a set of rules invented by people, but a reflection of eternal and immutable principles. To break the law meant to go against the will of the gods and the very nature of things. In this system, there was no clear division between secular and religious law. Any offense had both social and spiritual consequences. The criminal was accountable not only to the court, but also to the gods who awaited him in the afterlife. This concept explains why some punishments were directed not at the body, but at the soul and memory. For an Egyptian who believed in eternal life, the threat of oblivion was the most powerful deterrent. After all, to disappear from memory meant to disappear from eternity. Thus, the entire justice system was permeated with the idea of maintaining cosmic balance. Punishment was not an end in itself, but only a tool for correcting imbalances in the universe. And the most severe measures were applied to those who created the greatest chaos. I'm really interested to hear your thoughts. Do you think the modern justice system should focus more on restoring order and harmony, rather than just punishment? Let me know in the comments. Are you ready to learn the truth about how justice was administered in the shadow of the pyramids? In ancient Egypt, there were no professional lawyers, attorneys, or prosecutors as we understand them today. The judicial process was organized completely differently and relied on collegial bodies known as kenbet. The kenbet was a council of respected local residents. It could include priests, officials, scribes, and wealthy landowners. These people acted as judges, based on their authority and knowledge of local traditions. There were several levels of kenbet. Small kenbets dealt with cases at the village and small community level. More complex and important cases, such as those involving state property or serious crimes, were heard by the great kenbet at the court of the pharaoh or governor. The process began with the plaintiff filing a written complaint. Scribes played a key role, as they were the ones who drafted all official documents. Both parties, the plaintiff and the defendant, had to appear in person before the court and present their arguments. The judges listened to both sides as well as witness testimony. The main evidence was considered to be testimony under oath. A false oath taken in the name of the pharaoh or a god was considered a terrible crime and was severely punished. When rendering a decision, the kenbet sought not only to determine who was guilty, but also to find a compromise that would satisfy both parties. Often, decisions included not only punishment, but also compensation for damages. The idea of restoring justice was more important than formal compliance with the letter of the law. Court decisions were carefully documented. The judicial papyri that have survived contain detailed reports of the trials, including the names of the judges, witness testimony, and the final verdict. This bureaucratic precision was an integral part of Egyptian civilization. The highest court was the pharaoh himself, but he was most often represented by the vizier, Chati. The vizier could review the decision of any kenbet and deliver the final verdict. His court was considered the most fair and impartial. The absence of lawyers meant that everyone had to defend themselves. This required eloquence and persuasiveness from the participants in the process. The judges evaluated not only the facts, but also how the parties presented their case. Was such a court fair, where everything depended on your ability to speak and the social status of the judges? But what if I told you that even the most high-ranking officials could not escape justice? In the next chapter, you will learn about the unique methods that were used when the elite found themselves in the dock. This is what happens behind the closed doors of palaces when power and ambition lead to crime. One of the most notorious cases in the history of ancient Egypt was the conspiracy against Pharaoh Ramses III. This case is unique in that the court documents describe in detail not only the trial itself, but also the punishments imposed on the high-ranking conspirators. The conspiracy was organized by one of the pharaoh's wives who wanted to put her son on the throne. Dozens of people from the ruler's inner circle were involved: courtiers, officials, officers, and even servants from the harem. It was a large-scale attempt at a coup d'etat. After the conspiracy was uncovered, a special judicial commission of 12 high-ranking officials was formed. The pharaoh granted them extraordinary powers to investigate and pass sentence. This shows how serious a crime against the ruler was considered to be. The trial was thorough and detailed. All the defendants were divided into several groups depending on the degree of their guilt. The judges questioned each one, gathering evidence and testimony to get a complete picture of what had happened. The most interesting aspect of this case is the sentences handed down to the noble participants. Instead of direct physical punishment, which could have caused public unrest, the court applied a more sophisticated method. The conspirators were ordered to take their own lives, which allowed their families to avoid public disgrace. The names of the other participants in the conspiracy were changed. For an Egyptian whose name was inextricably linked to his identity and eternal life, this was a terrible punishment. Instead of noble names, they were given derogatory nicknames that forever branded them as traitors. For example, one of the main conspirators was called Pentor, but in court documents he is referred to by another contemptuous name. This was done in order to erase his true identity from history. His noble past was annulled. This case demonstrates that Egyptian justice was flexible and took into account the social status of the accused. The punishment for the elite was aimed at what they valued most: honor, name, and position in society. They were not simply punished, they were deprived of social and historical immortality. The judges who presided over the case did not escape responsibility either. Several of them were accused of having inappropriate relationships with the wives of the conspirators during the trial. This shows that even representatives of the judiciary were not above the law. The story of the conspiracy against Ramses III is a striking example of how the Egyptian justice system dealt with crimes within the highest echelons of power. It used psychological and social punishments that were no less effective than physical ones. It was a court that punished not only the body, but also the name. What if everything you've been taught about the grandeur of Egyptian construction has another darker side? One of the most common and severe punishments in ancient Egypt was exile to forced labor. Criminals convicted of serious offenses such as robbery or corruption were sent to places from which few returned. These were quarries, gold mines in Nubia, or remote military garrisons on the borders of the empire. Conditions in these places were extremely harsh. The scorching sun, lack of water, and heavy monotonous labor turned the lives of convicts into a daily struggle for survival. Such punishment was not simply deprivation of liberty, it was a complete separation of a person from their familiar life, family, and community. The convict lost their social status, property, and, in essence, their past. Work in the quarries was exhausting. The huge stone blocks that we see in temples and pyramids were carved out of the rocks using primitive tools. This work required enormous physical strength and endurance. The mines in the desert regions of Nubia were considered even more terrible places. The heat, sandstorms, and constant food shortages made survival there virtually impossible. Exile to Nubia was tantamount to a slow death sentence. Security in such places was strict, and escape attempts almost always ended in failure. The surrounding desert was a better guard than any overseer. There was simply nowhere to run. This form of punishment also served an important economic function. The labor of convicts was cheap labor that the state used to implement its grandiose construction projects. The greatness of the empire was literally built on broken lives. Sometimes entire families of criminals were sent to work. This was not only a form of collective punishment, but also a way to prevent revenge by relatives. The family shared the fate of their convicted member, losing all rights and freedoms. For an Egyptian whose life was closely connected with his hometown and the patronage of local gods, exile was a real tragedy. He found himself in a foreign land, far from the tombs of his ancestors and without hope of a proper burial. This jeopardized his eternal life in the afterlife. What do you think was the hardest part of such a life? Exhausting labor or complete isolation from home and loved ones? In the next chapter, you will learn about punishments that did not require physical effort, but struck at the most sensitive place: social status and well-being. Not all crimes in ancient Egypt led to exile or work in the quarries. For less serious offenses, especially those related to the economy and property, there was a developed system of fines and confiscations. These measures could turn a wealthy person into a pauper overnight. The amount of the fine depended on the severity of the crime and the social status of the offender. It was often measured in dabans, a unit of weight for copper, or in measures of grain, which was the main currency of the time. The fine could be so large that it required the sale of all property to pay it. Confiscation was an even harsher punishment. The court could order the seizure of all the convicted person's property in favor of the state or the injured party. This included land, houses, livestock, slaves, and all accumulated valuables. Such punishment not only deprived a person of their livelihood, but also destroyed their social position. In a society where status was largely determined by wealth, the loss of property meant the loss of respect and influence. The former rich man became an outcast. Confiscation was especially common for corrupt officials. Scribes or administrators caught taking bribes or stealing state property faced harsh punishment. Their property was seized and they were stripped of their positions. Court documents often contain detailed descriptions of confiscated property. Scribes meticulously listed every item, from fields and gardens to household utensils. This bureaucratic precision ensured that the state received everything down to the last penny. Sometimes the punishment was symbolic. For example, a thief could be sentenced to return twice or 3 times the value of what they stole. This not only compensated for the damage, but also served as a lesson to others. Economic penalties were an effective tool of control. They allowed the state not only to punish the guilty, but also to replenish the treasury at their expense. Justice and economics were closely intertwined. For a simple peasant or craftsman, even a small fine could be disastrous. To pay it off, he had to go into debt or give up part of his harvest. This could put his entire family on the brink of survival. Thus, hitting people in the pocketbook was one of the most effective ways to maintain order. It was less cruel than exile, but no less effective. The threat of losing everything that had been earned through years of labor was a powerful deterrent. What you never see in movies about pharaohs is the system of punishment for the educated elite. In a world where careers and reputations were built over decades, the most terrible sentence for an official or scribe was not physical punishment, but public disgrace and loss of office. It was a form of social destruction. For a member of the Egyptian elite, his position was everything. It not only provided income and power, but also determined his place in the complex social hierarchy. Losing one's position meant falling to the very bottom of society. The procedure for dismissal was humiliating. An official convicted of a crime could be publicly stripped of his insignia. His name was removed from the list of officials, and his place was taken by another. This punishment was often accompanied by public condemnation. The name of the offender could be read out in the main square, announcing his crimes. This permanently tarnished his reputation and that of his family. For a scribe, whose profession was considered one of the most prestigious, such punishment was the end of the world. He lost access to temples and archives, was deprived of his special status, and became a commoner. It was professional death. Sometimes the punishment was milder, but no less humiliating. For example, a negligent official might not be dismissed, but demoted and sent to serve in a remote province. This was a clear sign of disfavor and the collapse of all career ambitions. Such punishments were often applied for negligence or incompetence. If an official failed to fulfill his duties, for example, was unable to collect enough taxes, or allowed a building under construction to collapse, he faced severe punishment. The responsibility was personal and very high. The names of such disgraced officials could be scraped off the monuments they had erected. This was the first step towards complete historical oblivion. Their contribution to history was nullified. Do you think that public disgrace and loss of reputation can be a more effective punishment than a fine or imprisonment? But all these punishments, from hard labor to disgrace, paled in comparison to one fate that terrified every Egyptian. In the next chapter, we will reveal the essence of a punishment that concerned not earthly life, but eternal life. The entire earthly life of an ancient Egyptian was merely preparation for the main event, the posthumous judgment. They believed that after death, the soul of every person appeared before the judgment seat of the great god Osiris. This judgment was the final and most important instance, on whose decision eternity depended. The central moment of the judgment was the ceremony of weighing the heart. The heart of the deceased, which was considered the seat of reason and conscience, was placed on one side of the scales. On the other side was placed the feather of the goddess Maat, a symbol of truth and order. To pass the test, the heart had to be in balance with the feather or lighter than it. This meant that the person had led a righteous life and had not committed serious sins. A heavy heart, burdened with transgressions, inevitably pulled the scale down. Before weighing, the deceased had to recite a confession of denial. He listed 42 sins from which he was free, addressing 42 divine judges. It was a kind of declaration of innocence, on the truthfulness of which everything depended. If the heart passed the test, the gods recognized the deceased as righteous or justified. He received the right to eternal life in the fields of Yeru, the Egyptian paradise, where peace and abundance awaited him. This was the ultimate goal of every Egyptian's existence. But if the heart was heavier than the feather, the verdict was terrible. The soul of the sinner faced complete and utter destruction. It was devoured by the monster Maat, with the head of a crocodile, the body of a lion, and the hindquarters of a hippopotamus. This second death was the most terrifying thing an Egyptian could imagine. It meant not just the end of existence, but complete erasure from being. No chance of rebirth, no eternal life, only absolute nothingness. The most sophisticated and, from the Egyptians' point of view, the most terrible punishment was the curse of oblivion, or damnatio memoriae. It was applied to the most hated enemies of the state, usurpers, traitors, and heretical pharaohs. This punishment was more terrible than any physical punishment because it killed a person in eternity. The essence of this punishment was the systematic and complete destruction of all references to the person. For the Egyptians, a name and image were not just symbols, but an integral part of a person's identity. To destroy a name meant to destroy the very soul of a person and deprive them of the possibility of an afterlife. Special teams of workers knocked down cartouches with the names of the condemned from the walls of temples and obelisks. They erased his images, destroyed statues, and deleted his name from official chronicles and lists of kings. The goal was to make it seem as if this person had never existed. This punishment was a final sentence. A person whose name was forgotten could not be called by the gods in the afterlife. His soul was doomed to eternal wandering in darkness, with no hope of rebirth. One of the most famous examples of such punishment was the fate of the reformist pharaoh Akhenaten. After his death, the priests and subsequent pharaohs made enormous efforts to erase all traces of his religious reform. His name and images were destroyed throughout the country. The curse of oblivion shows how seriously the Egyptians took memory and eternal life. For them, history was not just the past, but an active force influencing the present and the future. And control over this force was in the hands of the ruling elite. This punishment was the highest form of political and religious retribution. It left no chance for rehabilitation. It was the complete and final erasure of a person from the fabric of the universe. In the Egyptian justice system, where there were no lawyers or complex forensic examinations, words played an enormous role. More precisely, words sealed with an oath. An oath in the name of a god or pharaoh was not just a formality, but a sacred act with real legal force. When the parties to a trial or witnesses gave testimony, they had to take an oath. They swore to tell the truth, invoking powerful gods such as Ra, Ta, or Amun as witnesses. It was believed that the gods heard every word and would punish liars. Breaking such an oath, perjury, was one of the most serious crimes. It was considered not only a deception of the court, but also a direct insult to the deity whose name was mentioned. It was a challenge not only to the earthly order, but also to the heavenly order. The punishment for a false oath was extremely severe. It could include the most severe measures, up to and including exile to forced labor. The Egyptians believed that even if a liar managed to deceive the earthly court, the punishment of the gods would inevitably catch up with him. This divine punishment could manifest itself in different ways. It was believed that the gods could send disease, crop failure, or misfortune to the entire family of the perjurer. But the main punishment was, of course, an unfavorable fate in the afterlife. The power of the oath was not only used in court, it was the basis for contracts, trade deals, and even marriage agreements. Taking an oath was a guarantee of the honesty of intentions and the reliability of a partner. Thus, the entire justice system was permeated with a deep belief that truth and falsehood could not escape the gaze of the gods. The oath was the bridge that connected the world of humans and the world of divine justice. And the price for deceit on this bridge was incredibly high. The principle of individual responsibility, which is the basis of modern law, was not always obvious to the ancient Egyptians. In some cases, especially when it came to serious crimes against the state, the principle of collective responsibility applied. This meant that the whole family could pay for the misdeeds of one person. This approach was based on the idea of the family as a single entity. The honor and reputation of the family were a shared value, and the disgrace of one member cast a stain on all relatives. Similarly, punishment could be extended to people who, from a modern perspective, were innocent. If a high-ranking official was convicted of treason or grand theft, his punishment often affected his wife and relatives. They could lose their property and status and be exiled along with the convicted person. The state sought to completely eradicate the bad seed. This was a powerful deterrent. A potential criminal had to think not only about the consequences for himself, but also about the fate he was preparing for his loved ones. The fear of condemning his family to poverty and disgrace stopped many. Some texts mention that the positions and titles belonging to the convicted person could not be inherited by his descendants. Thus, not only the present, but also the future of the entire family was punished. The career path for the children of a criminal was closed forever. The principle of collective responsibility was also evident in the economy. If the head of the family could not pay a debt or tax, the responsibility fell on his heirs. Debts were passed down from generation to generation, keeping families in constant dependence. The system strengthened the power of the state in the ruling elite. It made rebellion or conspiracy an extremely risky undertaking, as it was not just one life that was at stake, but the well-being of an entire clan. It was an effective tool of social control. Of course, this principle was not absolute and was not applied to minor offenses. But in matters of state importance, it became a formidable weapon in the hands of the pharaoh and his officials. It allowed them to root out any threat to order. This practice shows how different the worldview of the ancient Egyptians was from ours. For them, the interests of society, the state, and the cosmic order were significantly higher than the interests of the individual. And in the name of this order, it was possible to sacrifice the fate of the innocent. Thus, the dark side of Egyptian justice lay not only in the severity of the punishments, but also in its totalitarian nature. It could penetrate every home, destroying not only one life, but an entire family history, erasing it from the memory of generations. We have lifted the veil on one of the least studied aspects of life in ancient Egypt. Behind the glitter of gold and the wisdom of hieroglyphs lay a complex and sometimes harsh system of justice. Its purpose was not simply to punish the guilty, but to preserve the fragile balance of the universal order known as Maat. Punishments in Egypt were directed not only at the body, but also at what was much more important to the Egyptians: their social status, property, name, and even eternal life. From exile to the waterless desert to complete erasure from history, the arsenal of means for restoring harmony was wide and varied. This system reflects the worldview of a civilization for which earthly existence was only a prelude to eternity. Please suggest topics for future videos that you would like to see on our channel in the comments. Which civilization or era do you find most interesting for such an analysis? Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss our next explorations of the hidden pages of history.